Between 1603 and 1868, Japan was almost completely sealed off from the outside world. The Tokugawa shoguns locked the borders, banned most foreign trade, and cut the country off from the Industrial Revolution that was reshaping Europe and North America. During those 2.5 centuries, the rest of the world was building steam engines, coal mines, and factory farms. Japan was building something different. Using nothing but hand tools, gravity-fed water, and a recycling system that turned human waste into crop fuel, Japanese farmers doubled the amount of farmland across the entire country. They went from roughly 1.5 million hectares of cultivated land to about 3 million hectares in just the first 100 years of what historians call the Edo period. The population exploded alongside it, climbing from around 12 million people to more than 30 million. At least, that's the version that sounds like a feel-good nature documentary. The reality was far more interesting, far more brutal, and far more clever than that. To put this in perspective, consider what was happening in Europe during the same period. London was dumping raw sewage into the Thames and would not build a proper sewer system until the 1850s, after a summer so foul that Parliament could not sit in session because of the stench. Paris was not much better. Plague outbreaks swept through European cities on a regular cycle, fueled in part by terrible sanitation and contaminated water. European farmers were using techniques that had barely changed since the Middle Ages, relying on livestock, manure, and crop rotation. And even those methods left fields exhausted after a few generations. Japan took a completely different path, and the results were staggering. How does a country nearly double its food supply when every acre has to be cleared by hand? Every furrow has to be dug with wooden and iron hose, and the only source of energy bigger than a person is a wooden water wheel. The Japanese island chain is roughly 2/3 mountains. That alone should have made large-scale farming close to impossible. Flat, fertile plains are the exception in Japan, not the rule. Most of the country is steep slopes, narrow valleys, and volcanic soil that drains fast. For any civilization trying to grow wet rice, the crop that would become the foundation of Japanese society, this geography is a serious problem. Rice paddies need to hold standing water. They need level ground. They need irrigation that delivers water at exactly the right time and drains it at exactly the right time. And Japan's landscape offered almost none of that naturally. So the farmers made it themselves. The terraced rice fields that still dot Japanese mountainsides today are the most visible evidence of what Edo-period villagers accomplished. At a site called Uchinari in Oita Prefecture, more than 1,000 individual rice paddies were carved into the hillside by hand, covering over 40 hectares of steep terrain. The construction stretched from the Sengoku period through the Edo period, and 60 households maintained the entire system. Every wall was built from local stone, every level was graded by eye and by feel, and every drop of water that fed those paddies had to be channeled from streams above using ditches cut into the mountainside with nothing more than iron tools and physical labor. That was not an outlier. 6 locations in Oita Prefecture alone made the national list of Japan's top 100 terraced rice fields. Across the country, thousands of these staircase farms climbed slopes that modern engineers would think twice about developing with bulldozers. And no, I'm not making that up. In Genkai Town in Saga Prefecture, 283 stone-walled paddies rise from the coastline across 11.5 hectares, climbing away from the sea like a staircase built for a giant. These terraces were inherited continuously from the Sengoku and Edo periods, and they are still maintained today. In mid-April, when the paddies are flooded and the sun sets through the middle of the terrace line, the water and the sea behind it turn the same shade of orange. It looks like something from a painting, but it was built for one purpose only: growing rice on land that had no business growing anything. The farmers chose slopes on purpose. Before the Edo period refined techniques for irrigating flat plains and marshlands, hillside locations were actually preferred because gravity did the work of moving water downhill through the paddies. The logic was simple. If you cannot pump water, you let the mountain carry it for you. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The same period that produced those hand-carved terraces also produced some of the most ambitious flatland engineering Japan had ever seen. In the Kanto Plain, the broad lowlands surrounding what is now Tokyo, the Tokugawa government ordered the rerouting of the Tonegawa River itself. The entire river was redirected in the early 1600s using a set of techniques called the Kanto School, which involved earthen embankments, levee systems, and marsh drainage. The goal was to reclaim swampland and river deltas for new rice paddies, and the scale was enormous. Then, a century later, an engineer named Yasobe Izawa arrived from the Kishu domain at the invitation of the 8th shogun, Yoshimune. In 1722, Izawa redesigned the region's irrigation infrastructure using techniques from Western Japan. He replaced the older overflow embankments with solid reinforced channels, added bank protections downstream, and built the Minuma Dai-Yusui irrigation system, a network of canals that fed water to thousands of hectares of paddy fields north of Edo. The Horikawa Canal, built in 1663 by the Fukuoka domain, tells a similar story. An 11-kilometer main channel, with 77 kilometers of branch canals, all dug by hand, irrigating 664 hectares of rice paddies. The entire system was completed in about a year. The southern extension was added a century later. All of this was gravity-fed. There were no pumps, no diesel engines, and no concrete anywhere in the system. The embankments were packed earth and stone. The channels were lined with whatever local materials held water, and the maintenance was done by the same villagers who farmed the land. In Western Japan, where uncultivated flat land was scarce, the engineering took a different form. Coastal zones along the Yatsushiro Plain, Kojima Bay, and the Ariake Sea became targets for land reclamation. Farmers and laborers built dikes to hold back the ocean, drained tidal flats, and converted saltwater marsh into productive rice paddies. The work was backbreaking and the land was stubborn, but the results added enormous stretches of new farmland to regions that had been considered useless. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, or in this case, the kind of labor that makes modern construction crews stare. To understand why the government pushed this hard for more rice land, you have to understand what rice meant in Edo-period Japan. It was not just food, it was the economy itself. Feudal lords, the daimyo, measured their wealth and political power in a unit called the koku. One koku equaled roughly 150 kilograms of rice, enough to feed one adult for a full year. A daimyo needed an annual income of at least 10,000 koku to hold his rank. Samurai received their salaries in rice, which they could sell for cash. Farmers paid their taxes in rice, typically 40 to 50% of their harvest. A samurai earning less than 100 koku was classified as a gokenin, a lower vassal. An income between 100 and 9,500 koku made someone a hatamoto, an upper vassal of the Tokugawa house. To qualify as a daimyo, a feudal lord with real political power, you needed at least 10,000 koku annually. That is roughly 1.5 million kilograms of rice every year. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Making rice, the currency of political power, meant that every new hectare of paddy field directly increased the wealth and influence of whoever controlled it. The Tokugawa shogunate and the domain governments treated farmland expansion as a national priority, not because they cared about feeding people, but because more rice meant more tax revenue and more control. By the Kyoho period, around 1716 to 1735, the cultivated area had reached about 3 million hectares. That was an 80% increase in production area achieved in roughly a century. Most people never heard about this part. The expansion was not just about clearing new land, it was about making existing land produce more. And the system the Japanese developed for that might be the most ingenious closed-loop agricultural economy any pre-industrial civilization ever built. It started with waste. Specifically, human waste. In Edo-period cities like Osaka, Kyoto, and Edo itself, human excrement was not a sanitation problem. It was a commodity. Farmers from surrounding villages came into the city and purchased night soil from households, landlords, and public toilet operators. They hauled it back to their fields in buckets and barrels, mixed it with other organic materials, and spread it as fertilizer on their crops. While European cities in the same era were dumping sewage into their rivers and dealing with cholera outbreaks and contaminated drinking water, Japanese cities had clean streets and uncontaminated water supplies. The difference was not cultural superiority or some philosophical commitment to cleanliness. It was economics. Poop was worth money, so people collected it instead of letting it pile up. Landlords in Edo charged tenants for the right to sell the waste their household produced. The higher floors of apartment buildings generated less valuable waste than the lower floors because it was harder to carry down the stairs. And this price difference was actually written into rental agreements. People who collected and transported night soil to the countryside built real wealth from it, though society often treated them as outcasts for doing the dirty work nobody else wanted to touch. And somehow, it gets worse, or better, depending on your perspective. The night soil trade was just one layer of a multi-tiered fertilizer economy. Cooking ash from household stoves was collected by specialized brokers who resold it to farmers for use as soil amendment. Ash also went to sake brewers, indigo dyers, and paper makers. Karishiki, a compost made from cut grass and brushwood gathered from mountain common lands, was the baseline fertilizer for most of the 17th century. As demand grew, commercial fertilizers entered the market. Dried sardines, herring byproducts, and whale processing residue became premium soil additives that farmers paid real money for. The Nogyo Zensho, an agricultural encyclopedia published by Miyazaki Yasusada in 1697, laid out the entire system in detail. It described which fertilizers worked best in which soil types, the proper dilution rates for mixing liquid fertilizers with water, how close to the plant roots different fertilizers should be applied, and which stage of growth demanded which nutrient input. This was not guesswork. This was a codified science of soil management written 300 years ago, and its instructions were specific enough that modern agronomists can still follow them. The encyclopedia covered far more than fertilizer. It addressed seed selection, explaining the practice of soaking seeds in water and keeping only the ones that sank because heavier seeds produced stronger plants. It described the use of oils as insecticides. It catalogued crop varieties suited to different climates and elevations across the entire country. It was, in every practical sense, a farming textbook for a country that had no universities and no formal scientific institutions. And the Nogyo Zensho was not alone. Throughout the Edo period, a steady stream of agricultural manuals appeared across Japan. The Hayakusho Denki compiled practical knowledge passed between generations of peasant farmers. An agricultural writer named Nagatsune Okura spent decades traveling the provinces, observing how outstanding farmers managed their land and documenting the tools they used. He published a book called Nogu Benriron, a practical guide to effective farm tools that spread innovations from one region to another. He even started a sugar factory and introduced sumac cultivation to an entire domain. These writers were not armchair scholars. They were traveling practitioners who walked the fields, tested the methods, and published what actually worked. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. The fertilizer economy did not just improve crop yields. It created a self-sustaining loop between city and countryside that kept both running for over 200 years. Urban populations generated waste. Farmers bought the waste and turned it into food. The food went back to the cities. The cities generated more waste. Every element cycled. Nothing was thrown away because nothing was considered disposable. This loop extended into the forests. The Satoyama system, a landscape management practice that blurred the line between wilderness and farmland, provided the organic material that kept the whole cycle turning. Each village maintained several acres of managed woodland for every hectare of rice paddy under cultivation. A family of 7 or 8 people typically needed about 4 acres of Satoyama forest. From these woods, villagers gathered green leaves and leaf litter for composting, timber for building, bamboo shoots and mushrooms for food, and firewood for cooking and heating. The woodland was not left to grow wild. It was actively managed, kept in an early successional state so that it produced maximum biomass for composting. Trees were coppiced, underbrush was cleared on a rotation, and the forest floor was raked clean of fallen leaves every season. The result was a landscape that looked like a park, but functioned like a factory. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. Except in the Edo period, it was not a question of legality, it was survival. Local communities governed the commons through strict rules about who could harvest what, when, and how much. Overharvesting meant the compost supply failed, which meant the rice yields dropped, which meant the village could not pay its taxes. And failure to pay taxes in Edo, Japan had consequences that made modern tax penalties look gentle. By the Kyoho period in the 1720s, the population had stabilized around 31 million people. The agricultural system was feeding them all, even though almost every calorie was produced by hand. The tools that made this possible were remarkably simple. The senbakoki, a toothed threshing comb, appeared in the mid-1600s and immediately sped up the process of separating rice grains from stalks. Before the senbakoki, threshers ran individual rice plant heads through a comb-like tool one at a time, a process that was agonizingly slow. The senbakoki's iron teeth could strip multiple stalks at once, and it became standard equipment across the country within a few decades. The tumi, a hand-cranked winnowing machine adapted from a Chinese design, used wind generated by a manually turned fan to separate grain from chaff. One person fed the grain in from above, while another turned the crank. The machine could be adjusted to change the airflow, and it worked well enough that it remained in use long after the Edo period ended. The rice milling process itself was pure manual labor. Women pushed and pulled the top of a heavy stone mill using a large wooden handle while someone else fed grain into the center. The work was so repetitive and exhausting that farmers developed an entire genre of songs called usuhiki uta, milling songs, to keep the rhythm and stay sane during the hours of grinding. The songs were not entertainment, they were survival tools, keeping workers synchronized and conscious during shifts that could last all day. Water wheels were the only widely used power source beyond human muscle. Before the end of the Edo period, the water wheel was the main tool for processing grain, specifically for hulling and polishing rice. Wind power was tried in a few limited areas for irrigation and rice cleaning, but Japan's typhoon season made windmills impractical for most of the country. Animal power was surprisingly rare, partly because the dense population and scarce land made it difficult to raise enough livestock, and partly because human labor was abundant enough that animals were not needed. Even in regions like Okayama and parts of Kyushu, where animals were occasionally used, it was not until 1902 that someone, an inventor named Shikakichi Okuyama, figured out how to reliably connect animal power to hullers and threshers. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The labor itself was organized through village-level systems that turned individual farms into collective operations during the most demanding seasons. Rice planting and harvesting required enormous amounts of coordinated work. A single family could not transplant an entire paddy field alone, and the timing had to be precise. Plant too early and the seedlings die. Plant too late and the growing season runs short. The Yui system, a tradition of mutual labor exchange, solved this. Families within a village or a group of neighboring households reciprocally provided labor to each other during planting and harvest. When your paddy needed transplanting, your neighbors showed up. When their paddy needed harvesting, you did the same. No payment was expected. No reward was given. The system ran on reciprocity and social obligation, and it worked because everyone depended on everyone else. The transplanting season itself was a massive coordinated event. Japanese rice farmers had learned as far back as the 3rd century that they could dramatically improve yields by growing seedlings in a dedicated seedbed first, then transplanting them into the flooded paddy in orderly rows. This method made weeding easier and gave every plant equal access to water and sunlight. But it also meant that during a narrow window in early summer, an enormous amount of labor had to converge on the fields at exactly the right moment. The entire village mobilized. Men, women, and children waded into knee-deep water and pressed seedlings into the mud in rows, one by one, for hours and days on end. Underneath that informal exchange sat a more rigid structure. The Gonin-gumi, or five-household group, was the basic administrative unit of Edo-period villages. 5 families were bound together in collective responsibility for tax payment, law enforcement, and mutual aid. If one household could not pay its rice tax, the other 4 covered the shortfall. If one household broke the law, the other 4 faced consequences. It was a system designed to make neighbors police each other, and it was brutally effective at keeping villages productive and orderly. The village headman, known as the shoya in Western Japan or nanushi in the East, governed the village through these structures. Villages were taxed as a unit, not as individual farms. Criminal punishment could be applied to the whole village. The pressure to conform and contribute was enormous, and it explains why Edo-period agriculture achieved such extraordinary productivity per acre. When your neighbor's failure becomes your problem, you make sure your neighbor does not fail. This was the system that fed Japan for 265 years. It produced enough rice to sustain a civilization of over 30 million people on a mountainous island chain, with almost no flat land. It did it without fossil fuels, without synthetic fertilizers, without tractors, without electricity, and without any of the technology that the Western world now considers essential to agriculture. If you enjoy videos like this, hit subscribe. I cover history and engineering stories like this every week. By the 1850s, the cracks were starting to show. The population had stabilized, but the land had been pushed close to its limits. Famines hit the country periodically throughout the Edo period, including severe ones in the Kyoho era of 1732 and the Tenmei period from 1782 to 1787. In regions like the Tsugaru domain in northern Japan, heavy rice taxes, combined with bad harvests, killed an estimated 1/3 of the population during the worst famines. The system worked in normal years, but it had almost no margin for error. The same relentless focus on rice production that fed the nation also trapped it. Domains squeezed farmers harder whenever they needed more revenue, shipping rice south to Edo for sale while local people starved. The closed-loop fertilizer economy could not scale fast enough when populations surged in some regions. The forests were being cut faster than they could regenerate in areas where demand for compost and firewood exceeded what the Satoyama system could sustain. A specific detail was a warning sign. Those famines, the system had no shock absorber. When the harvest failed, there was no backup food supply, no grain reserves from overseas, no alternative. The population had grown to match exactly what the land could produce in a good year, and a bad year meant death. In the Tenmei famine, entire villages in the northeast were wiped out. Travelers described roads lined with the bodies of people who had tried to walk to regions where food was still available. When the Meiji Restoration arrived in 1868 and Japan opened its borders to the world, industrially processed fertilizers flooded the market within a few decades. Soybean meal imported from overseas replaced night soil for many farmers. The economic relationship between city and countryside, the one that had kept both sides running for over 2 centuries, began to unravel. Farmers no longer needed the city's waste, and the city no longer had buyers for it. Human excrement went from being a commodity to being a disposal problem, the same shift that had happened in European cities centuries earlier, except in reverse. By the 1960s, the transformation was complete. Machines replaced the labor of 4 people with 1 operator. Mechanical transplanters and harvesters eliminated the need for UE labor exchanges. The Gonin-gumi structure dissolved. Young people left the villages for factory jobs in cities, and the terraced rice paddies that had taken generations to build began to fall into disuse as the families who maintained them moved away. Today, some of those terraced fields survive as heritage sites. The Oyama Senmaida terraces near Tokyo, 375 paddies of various shapes spread across steep terrain, still grow rice using only rainwater, held in place by the same clay soil that made them famous during the Edo period. The rice from these paddies was considered among the finest available near Edo. And it was grown without any river water at all, a rarity that depended entirely on the water-holding capacity of the local earth. The terraces have been compared to pyramids, not for their shape, but for the scale of human labor they represent, and the cultural knowledge embedded in their construction. The difference is that the pyramids stopped being useful the day they were finished. The terraces kept feeding people for centuries. The Edo-period agricultural system was not perfect. It could not prevent famine. It often crushed the people who operated it under heavy taxes and rigid social control. The Gonengumi system was as much a surveillance tool as it was a mutual aid network. And the farmers who built those terraces, dug those canals, and hauled night soil from the cities were among the most heavily taxed and tightly controlled people in the world. But the system worked. It fed a nation for over 250 years, using nothing but ingenuity, manual labor, recycled waste, and an intimate understanding of how water, soil, plants, and people fit together. Every tool was built by hand. Every canal was dug with shovels. Every terrace was leveled by feel. And the nutrient cycle that kept it all running was so efficient that nothing, not even human waste, was allowed to go to waste. The farmland that those Edo-period villagers carved out of mountains and drained from marshes, those 3 million hectares of rice paddies and crop fields, they are still part of Japan's agricultural landscape today. The irrigation canals they built still carry water. The terraces they shaped still hold it. 3 million hectares, 30 million people, 265 years, and not a single power grid in sight.